Good morning. Well, I was introduced, my scientific field is science systems assessment of water-related research. Now you ask yourself, what is that? It's about studying innovation systems, and currently I myself involved in what can the Nexus Approach do for the implementation of good science in the real world. So that's very important. It is a privilege to be the moderator because of the speakers, of course, because moderating is the simplest part, and having good keynote speakers is the essence of this meeting. It's on two subjects. They are sort of contrasting subjects, both sides of the same Nexus medal, I would say. One speaker is on resilient cities, the other on multifunctional land use, bringing the rural and the urban landscapes, and I would say mindscapes as well, together. Now, we shouldn't lose time too much on discussing the issue. I will introduce the first speaker. It is Dr. Jerome Deli Priscoli. For many of us, he doesn't need much of an introduction because he's an old hand, as we say, on the subject. And I would like to highlight as an introduction to his very impressive career a few achievements, tasks, and roles you have been performing over the years. He's a water policy advisor, a well-known advisor internationally, a key representative as a senior advisor to the well-known US Army Corps of Engineers. You were retired, but you spent a lot of time there, traveling with us worldwide on the subject. He's an academic as well. He's an editor-in-chief of the well-known Water Policy Scientific Journal of IWA, and I would say he's a constant factor during all 6 World Water Forums, including the one in my own country, the Netherlands, in 2000, if I remember well, where the now king played an important role in the forum. And he's a key person on the subject of conflict resolution and engaged. And of course, I Googled you last night again because I follow you very carefully. You're engaged at the highest level on many subjects and at many occasions. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University in international politics and government. And I found out that you did work on theology and philosophy. So we will see. Your talk is called Water Investments, Fundamental Social Means for Adapting to Climate Change and Building Resilience in Our Cities. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Deli Priscoli.
Thank you, Wim. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. And I want to welcome the colleagues I haven't seen for a long time, excellencies, and a special thank you to the universities, UN University, and to Dresden, and the Ecological Institute, Teresa, who's been working so hard on this. As you can see, I'd like to talk briefly about the relationship of water resources investments, which really need integrated water management, and what that may mean for adapting to climate change and making resilient cities. But to begin, first, one ethical reflection and two quick analytical reflections. The first, and this is to form the remarks. First, I'd ask the question, are we raising the fears and anxieties over impacts of projected changes in our climate, so the changes and variabilities, but inadvertently denying the means to cope with these impacts to the people who are going to be affected? The major reasons that are repeatedly used in the talking points that we hear by many officials for why everybody should be concerned, a lot of it has to do with water-related events. In fact, most of it. The survey by the French Water Partnership of the INDCs, for example, notes that 92% of these are water-related. And therefore, water is among the first priorities in any forms of adaptation. But when we focus the world's attentions on the longer-term mitigations that we are spending so much time on, what are we doing about adapting to the events that are going to occur, and what are we doing to help the people who are going to be affected by them. The first analytical reflection to frame this is that water resource investments really, and most of us know this here, are at the heart of adapting to climate change or climate variabilities. The historical explanations of climate variability clearly shows how linked the professional communities in water and in the climate change really are. But nevertheless, the data on the climate changes in water and precipitation and stream flow are vague often. For examples, the chart, if I can manipulate this properly, the charts here reflect that the variabilities that we see in the impact in the, in North America, you can see droughts have had pronounced multi-year to multi-decadal variability, but there's really no convincing evidence for long-term, somebody want to help me with this? Somebody help me with that. They really have some, they don't have evidence for long-term trends. Will this one work? Okay. The Holocene Asian monsoon period is linked, no, it's not working, is linked historically to solar changes. I need to get the mouse on there. The decadal variability of the Mekong rainfall over 1,000, that's it, okay, over 1,000 years, as you can see, is constantly changing. So what does all this mean? Climate variability in the key water-related events stemming from the changes have always been with us. But the regional trends in these extreme events are not always captured by the GCMs, and it's difficult to assess the significance of these discrepancies. So this has led a number of hydrologists and water managers to say that the best approach is to factor in resiliency in water resource design, and it's probably the safest approach. So, if the academic and political communities are going to offer any reasonable social impact assessments of these changes, we've got to encourage more cooperation between modelers of climates and modelers of water. The second analytical reflection to frame this is that managing the variabilities in risks, in water especially, is necessary to reduce poverty, to break the fatalistic determinisms that come from this, what we would call intergenerational memories, and to create wealth by building platforms for growth. So let me turn attention to some of cities in the world and some context for this. In their ongoing research on benefits and costs of adaptation for 23 cities, Baraki and Tassin note that it is very difficult to separate the climate changes and other trends, such as population growth, urbanization. This is a little bit like the first analytical reflection. But their in-depth comparison of 4 cities in the Maghreb, Alexandria, Tunis, Algiers, Casablanca, shows very high benefit-cost ratios, that's at a net present value, for disaster risk reduction measures. However, the costs of investments to help people adapt are huge, especially for the low probability events. Like many others, the authors note that politicians and the publics they serve have often short memories with these events. They do not take the threats sufficiently seriously, especially after the events have come and gone. And those of us who have worked in the public sector understand this. Based solely on the socioeconomic data and economic change, the World Bank projects average global flood losses to be increasing over $50 billion by 2050. With the new patterns of variability in climate and subsidence and so forth, the protection could be upgraded, really needs to be upgraded, and it may be to deal with losses, it could be over $1 trillion. The report lists 10 of the most vulnerable cities when measured as expected when you look at damages as a percentage of GDP. Now, maybe if I use the, yeah, okay, that'll work better, okay? So if we look at damages as a percentage of GDP, the most vulnerable cities around the world are Guangzhou, New Orleans, Guayaquil, Ecuador, Ho Chi Minh City, Abidjan, Zanjing, Mumbai, and Bangladesh, Palembang in Indonesia, and Shenzhen. And in most of these cities, what's really important, the poor are most at risk through rapid urbanization, which has pushed them into the most vulnerable neighborhoods. At the same time, protecting these cities in the future is going to take a substantial investment in structural defenses, as well as better planning and as well as more behavioral measures. According to OECD, good adaptation strategies should focus on the range of risks crossing all of the water services. So we shouldn't be separating water services and water management planning and so forth. For example, WHO notes that under extreme events, water and wastewater service systems stand to lose much of their environment and the health benefits under certain disasters. So in short, IWRM becomes a necessary tool for water adaptation investments. Now, while studies of the damages are growing, there is much more analysis of damages due to floods or flood-related type events than droughts. However, beyond looking at post-event damages, there's very little on the performance analysis of disaster risk investments, and that means in terms of damages prevented or avoided. Many of us know about the World Bank data describing Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Mozambique, which portray how GDPs vary with rainfall. The variations in GDP due to the inability to deal with these variations and to manage them can account for almost 25 to 30% of variations in GDP. And in fact, IMI, which is one of the groups up here, in 2009 noted that Ethiopia's limited ability to cope with droughts and floods are estimated to cost the economy 1/3 of its potential growth. And it seems that disaster risk reduction and infrastructure investment brings damages as a percentage of GDP to roughly around 5% in the rich world, as opposed to almost 25 to 30% estimated in the poorer worlds. So the means to flatten out the hydrograph need to be taken to avoid accelerating these discrepancies between the poor and the rich. The Institute for Water Resources, where I spent most of my career, shows a relationship between the Human Development Index and damages as a percentage of GDP. You can see the movement in the transition of countries to the upper left. When we look at damages in the United States over 100 years or so due to water-related events, we can see that damages increased, but damages as a percentage of GDP decreased. This is borne out also in the figures below with China and post-war Japan. These capture some of the interactions between two dynamic systems, the nature and humans. As the index, so-called here, damages as a percentage of GDP lowers, it becomes an indicator possibly of increased resilience. Why? Because resilience is to allow the social systems to continue functioning even under the stress of the large-scale natural events. Let's look at a few cases a little bit more closely. In 2005, the world watched as Katrina devastated New Orleans. 1.2 million people evacuated, 1.5 million displaced, 1,500 people died. Direct property damage losses is over $20 billion, and interesting for our work here, almost $6 billion of infrastructure losses because of this. More than triple from any other disaster in this area. The American Society of Civil Engineers noted that the failures, however, came that we didn't have a system in place. We called it that. It was not really the sum of the parts. It was not system-wide, and it really didn't have kind of a system-wide design to it. This resulted from changing technical configurations over a period of time, rising costs, projected extensions, unclear mixing of cost sharing because states and federal governments have to pay, and a variety of technical considerations. In other words, we had a perfect storm of all the policy and the economics at the same time as the storm occurred. However, in a more positive vein, in the late summer of 2011, the Mississippi River reached some of the highest recorded levels in our history in the U.S. It was managed through the Mississippi River and Tributaries program. This is a project that's taken and constructed over 75 years. In that 2011 event, It was close to the size of the 1927 event, which paralyzed literally 2/3 of the United States. By contrast, in 2011, 4 million people in numerous medium-sized cities, as well as rural areas, were protected. This 80-year project realized almost well over $470 billion in flood damage prevented, which means it had a very large positive return. Interestingly also, its authorization legislation to the Congress in 1930, in its first paragraph, said that this plan must include room for the river. A similar story can be seen in the performances of the Three Gorges Dam and the Yangtze floods of 2011, especially regarding the megacities downstream of the dam. Tragically, non-attention to water infrastructure investment resulted in significant losses in the Indus floods of that same period. 1/5 of the country was covered, 10 million people were left homeless, and more than 21 million people were affected. The 4 provinces and several cities were engaged in rather cutthroat battles for shares of flood aid money and refugees streaming into the city. The Pakistani and U.S. post-flood studies at our institute showed that if the proposed storages were put in place, which had been basically put aside for many, many years, possibly 65 to 100% of the flood volumes could have been dealt with. While some have seen this flood as an indicator of dramatic climate change, most hydrologists see it more or less like a 50-year event, not necessarily an extreme event. But what happened? It was a huge, huge disaster. Over the years, socioeconomic activities have increased with little attention given to the adaptive investments needed to help the people manage the events and help the people who are going to be affected by this. So if this situation is repeated worldwide, one may ask, what's going to happen if even larger events occur in such situations? In October 2012, 117 people in the United States were killed, 650,000 homes were damaged and destroyed up in the East Coast and around New York City by Superstorm Sandy. The damage estimates in the area exceeded $60 billion. Sandy alerted the United States to this growing challenges of the variability and the changes in climate and urban design. The figure here in Manhattan, which I believe is from National Geographic magazine, it depicts how Manhattan would look with an additional 5 feet of sea level rise. So assuming there's some sea level rise that occurs, and just putting on top of that the 13-foot storm surge from Sandy. That means you eliminate Wall Street and all of lower Manhattan. Assessments reveal there's significantly less damages, however, in social disruption along these corridors from the hurricane events where there was some existing shoreline and shore protection projects. The third climate assessment of the United States, which came as a result of this, noted the nation's security, economy, and culture depend on the resilience of urban infrastructure systems, and I haven't heard that as explicitly stated in our public documents before. So how will New York and other coastal cities prepare for this type of inundation? Well, I'd like to conclude with a few emergent lessons. I picked about 10 that, out of many, and they should be familiar to you. We must plan, or better plan, for the prevention in the growing megacities around the globe, and not just view these events in terms of humanitarian post-disaster responses. The big cities are going to require more infrastructure investment, together with the appropriate non-structural measures like land use and zoning and other regulations to avoid the increases in damages. Estuaries and wetlands perform valuable services in dissipating these impacts, and there's a broad consensus that we've got to do something about renourishing and restoring their functions. We need better early warning systems and to increase the, quote, people-centered flood warning and dissemination and communication systems. This is critical. Since absolute safety is not possible, we must find ways to minimize the effects when and if project designs are exceeded. That's not project failures. That's when the designs are exceeded, which is likely also to happen. The positive relationships between managing the uncertainties of extreme weather events, economic development, and social well-being are critical. Residual risk is almost always underestimated because it's difficult to quantify the cascading series of highly interdependent measures, each of which has its own reliability characteristics and its own risks of failure. Because people bear the risks, their involvement in actually choosing levels of risk and their participation in the tough operational decisions made during the processes of planning for the mitigation of these events is critical to the health of political systems and especially critical to democratic systems, and I would go further to say it's one of the most critical issues we face today. Multiple defenses are important. This means creating packages of natural and human processes such as evacuation routes, elevated routes, flood-proofing buildings, pumping stations, levees, floodgates, highways, natural bridges, wetland nourishment, barrier islands, and so forth. And I would emphasize again, especially how we look at evacuations in the ways to do that. Hydrometeorological data needs to have public access. It needs to be shared. And finally, more data on benefits and costs of disaster risk investment and more performance data on the damages prevented of existing disaster risk measures is needed. This is something that's rare. I guess you have to have invested in this and be a fairly wealthy country to be doing this, but we need to be looking at what would have happened with the events that we monitor had not the investments been there, and we need information on that. And that was some of what I was giving in this earlier part. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, the United Nations notes that adaptation to climate change is mainly about better water management. Thus, water investments must be the key parts of any adaptation strategies or mechanisms negotiated around our discussions on the variabilities in climate. In the end, the heart of this paradigm that is emerging is that more than preserving or restoring, we're actually jointly designing our ecology or our home with nature. Thank you very much, and sorry for the glitch on our little PowerPoint. Thank you.
I think dialogue is very important, so there are room microphones, so I invite you to raise questions to Dr. Della Priscoli. One or two, well, please. Otherwise, the moderator has to put forward a question. That's, of course, not the idea. Well, you think about a question. Yes, there is a question. Please. Go to the microphone. Please, your name and affiliation, and then your question.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Andre Lindner from the university here in Dresden. And I just want to ask if you have heard about the rather new term of climate chaos, like an amount of variability and change where complex systems like urban systems or economic systems cannot adapt anymore. And I would like to have your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I am, I guess, a person who's an eternal optimist. I have trouble when we say we can't, because this is humanity. We need to do things. It's not, I like to quote my favorite philosopher, this Teilhard, because it's not the fear of what's going to happen, but the human will to live that's most important, that drives us. So that's my first answer. That isn't to say let's not do the science and everything else to understand these points of change, because we may be able to change some design. But my first reaction to it is, let's put that in the positive light. What's it going to do? Because if you say cities cannot change and cannot deal with resilience, I'm not sure where that leaves us.
Not fast enough. That's maybe
my point. Fast enough. Well, what does that mean?
Okay, that's an answer to your question, not completely.
No, actually, there's a good, in the case I gave, there's a very good response to it, because we have an argument, in New Orleans, which is really low. in the United States, and we still haven't really addressed your question more seriously, like, why should everybody be living there? And there's plenty of space for them to move, and why can't that happen?
Okay, thank you. There was another question, please. There's a microphone.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Csaba Körösi. I'm working for the Hungarian president. Jerry, thank you very much indeed for a very impressive presentation. Could I ask you the impossible? To explain for politicians, how much would it cost to make the optimum scenario for the cumulative risk reduction tools? How much would it save? Vis-a-vis the business as usual scenario if we would not do that investment. So what is the difference between the two and what could we gain?
Well, you know, part of the answer to that is what the appeal I made to trying to understand what the investments that are in place have done. I realize it's extremely difficult. Like on the Mississippi, you can make estimates with a huge event and something in place, so we could start to answer that. But even when you answer that, there may not be enough money in the world to repeat what's done, because this is all very structural, and you need to do kinds of behavioral and other changes. The politicians and the political colleagues have to be more engaged in this process of assessing what we call the risks and making statements about it. This is what I meant about democratic systems. You know, it used to be the engineers would say, okay, we build and do something and people feel they're safe. Then something happens and they get wet or something, even if the project worked, but there was overtop, but nobody quite understood what we're meaning by this residual risk. And it's very, very difficult. It is really critical in our societies that people are actually engaged in the acceptance of these levels of risk. Because this is actually a very important decision that has to be made in an accountable, legitimate format. And I don't have an easy answer, except to say that our software and hardware tools and collaborative modeling type things and shared vision, the stuff that's being done now, couldn't have been done 5 years ago. We actually bring stakeholders into technical kinds of modeling discussions. Is here, and it's growing, and it is the future. It may be like other things that we've seen in our history and civilizations, is that the technology does catch up with what we need and help us. That's the optimist view.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Priscoli, for a great presentation.